Hi there and good evening. Welcome to the Jim Bohannon Show from Westwood One Radio. We're at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. Online, you'll find us at jimbotalk.net. Quickly, whose birthday is it? Saturday. We'll pause. George Washington, number 282, as a matter of fact, depending on, of course, whether or not you use the Gregorian calendar or not. But, in fact, I'll give you a list of all the presidents born on President's Day. That's the complete list. But, we couldn't very well celebrate both Lincoln and Washington, so we came up with the compromise. But George Washington, father of our country, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen, who at one point, of course, chopped down all the trees in the redwood forest out west and hurled General Cornwallis across the Potomac River. Or I may have a few of these things possibly mixed up. Matter of fact, there are myths about this man. You would expect that, obviously, as a person of his impact on our history. And we may be able to separate a few of those things out tonight and look at some of the really important things about Washington, things which I might add I don't recall being emphasized when I was in school. I had to learn these things pretty much on my own later down the road. We're talking tonight with a man who is one of the indirect descendants of George Washington. He, of course, did not have children himself. The great-nephew, Austin Washington, joins us. And a pleasure to have you with us, Austin.
It's a great pleasure to be here with you.
And you are the author of The Education of George Washington, How a Forgotten Book Shaped the Character of a Hero. It's published by Regnery History.
That is correct. Yeah. And it starts at about the time his actual education stopped, his sort of formal education stopped. He was really insecure his whole life about his lack of education. He didn't speak Latin the way his contemporaries did. He didn't go to the great school in England that his older half-brothers had gone to. And yet, ironically, my book is called The Education of George Washington.
Interesting. Because he was hanging around some pretty bright dudes like Jefferson and Madison and all this sort of thing.
He was. And Jefferson said that George Washington was extremely slow, extremely plodding at coming to a decision, but he always came to the right one. Because he had a kind of a deeper education, in my opinion.
Now, this is a guy, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, among other things, I believe it is true of George Washington that he came that close to being commissioned in the British Navy, in which case he might very well have been part of the force that tried to rescue General Cornwallis.
Well, there is that incident in his youth. What bothers me about most books about George Washington is they go through the same plot. Like, there's 6 incidents before he's 17 that anyone mentions. And I've deliberately shaped this book to sort of emphasize different things than most people emphasize. So I know of that incident. It's not in my book. I'm sorry.
Fair enough. And these are not in your book either, I'm sure. But just for the record, first of all, no one ever claimed that he tossed $1 across the Potomac River. It was the Rappahannock River.
Exactly. But do you know what's amazing about that? I bet you don't know this.
Okay.
He started at one point, just before he became president, to co-write a biography of himself. Did you know that?
I certainly did not know that.
And so it was kind of stuck together from different fragments recently.
And nobody ever pieced it together?
Well, somebody has.
That's good.
But this is the crazy thing. He wrote some notes for the guy, David Humphreys, who was doing it.
Right.
And he said at the top, burn these. Don't let anyone see them. Because he was embarrassed to be saying good things about himself. George Washington was a great person, but he wasn't a saint. And he was a human, and he understood a little bit about the way the world worked. And so the story of the rock across the Rappahannock, say that 3 times fast, was, it came from many places, but one of the places was his own handwriting. George Washington wrote about the rock across the Rappahannock in the third person, as if it was somebody else, because he thought David Humphreys would take his story and put it verbatim into his book. But so he did do that.
He did actually. He made the throw. Well, it depends, of course, where on the river. There are places where that wouldn't be that great a throw.
It's actually it's known where it was. I can't tell you. It's in the book. Offhand, I can't tell you the exact spot. But in the 1930s, there was the Washington Senators.
Yeah.
You surely remember the Washington. Oh, you do remember them.
I not only remember them, I actually attended some of their games. I've been in this town that long.
Okay. So anyway, so so it was a picture from the Washington Senators went there and took 3 attempts. but he made it across the river, so it is possible.
It's possible.
And they do know,
And of course, obviously, the story, which is again not the central thrust of this, but for the record, since it is supposedly reflective of the man's morals and character, I cannot tell a lie, Father. I chopped down the cherry tree.
How long do we have before the next commercial break? Because I can talk about this for a long time.
Well, let's give you 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll do it quickly.
Okay.
No, okay, so here's... Okay, it upsets me so much. See, this is why this book is a good book, The Education Book. Because people don't... If you look at even serious history books...
Yes.
You look at the quotes they use, and they all use the same quotes. And if you actually look at the thing these quotes are coming from, it's always out of context. It's like news. Not your news, of course, but much news. They blow things... So anyway, so you look at Mount Vernon's website. I love Mount Vernon. I loved Jim Reese.
Spent many an hour at Mount Vernon.
And if Jim Reese is listening, thank you for helping get this book off the ground. But their website, maybe not today, but when I wrote this book, said... Is the story of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree true? But that's not the story. If you look at Parson Weems' story,
yes.
which one he gives the source,
right,
which is a relative of George Washington. It never says he chopped down a cherry tree.
Yeah, but that of course is how it's been relayed to people.
This is what history in most people's hands does.
Yes.
This is why my book is wonderful because it relies. In a serious way, I get very excited when I speak on the radio. The book has a lot of serious stuff in it.
Well, you're more than welcome to be as excited as you wish.
Right, but so anyway, why would I try
to stay reasonably close to that microphone?
So you go to this story, and so it says that George was given a hatchet, and he experimentally chopped. It didn't say experimentally. He says sorry, that's my interpretation.
That's the kind of excuse I would have used.
What it says is he barked. That's the verb. And so here's the deal. Mozart could write music at 6. Is it so unlikely that George Washington could tell the truth? 1. 2. It was an incredible... I mean, there's a whole chapter of... The book is a serious book, but at the start of the book, there's a whole chapter of D.D. mythologizing it. Yes. So in George Washington's Virginia, it was incredibly important, to be honest. There were no credit cards. There were no checking accounts. There wasn't a lot of money. Everything was paid on 80%, credit. You had to be honest. And so if something like this happened, which it probably did, it is exactly the story that George's parents would have told and retold. And the thing is, all that Parson Weems said about George Washington's early life turns out to be pretty darned accurate. But he didn't have access to George Washington's papers. He just had access to his neighbors. He lived in the neighborhood. And so the incident is probably based on a true incident.
Interesting. So a lot of these things may not be literally true, and they may have arrived in our ears by a convoluted route, but nonetheless there is a kernel of truth behind many of them.
Well, yeah, I mean, people reject that story because Parson Weems told it as a children's fable.
Yeah.
And the language in which people spoke in his fables was a bit highfalutin, even for Virginians of that day.
Yeah.
And it probably isn't exactly the way things happened. But it's the kind, 50 years later, he said the most important, thing, one of the most important things he wanted in life was to be known, to have the reputation, the character of an honest man. If he thought it at 56, surely he thought it at 6, right?
It depends. I would have to say personally that my character probably was better formed by, let's say, 18 or 22 than it was at 6.
Possibly. But the thing is, people build it up. People say, like, it's such an unlikely thing. But really? It's really that unlikely?
Not that unlikely. I would put it personally more along the category of above average or maybe even extraordinary, but unlikely. Right. I've known really honest young people.
Yeah.
They were really usually stick in the mud type of people we didn't like to play with a lot. But we will come back and we will talk some more. It's important that we know about this man because of some things that he did, and most importantly of all, some of the things that he did not do. He did not become a North American king, even though his own troops at one point, facing a very corrupt and disorganized Congress, urged him. His officers from the Revolution said, let's go. We'll take the thing. You can run the country. You can run the country forever. And he refused to do so. And then, having agreed to be a democratically elected president with some limits on his power, far more than you find on today's presidency, he was able to run for 4-year terms forever. He could have become de facto president for life. After 2 terms, he said, no, that's it. That's it. And that has been a precedent which has, for the most part, been followed by our presidents throughout history until finally we institutionalized it with the constitutional amendment after World War II. 1-866-50-JIMBO is our number, 1-866-505-4626. He would have been 282 on Saturday. George Washington, the father of our country. And great-nephew Austin Washington is with us, the author of The Education of George Washington, published by Regnery History, and subtitled How a Forgotten Book Shaped the Character of a Hero. We'll learn what that book is and what is in it when we come back. Good to have you with us on the Jim Bohannon Show at 1-866-50-JIMBO, 1-866-505-4626. We're going to be learning a few things about the Founding Father. Father number one, the mother of all fathers, however you want to describe him, George Washington, first president, the leader of the troops, who, if I'm not mistaken, probably lost more battles than he won, but he won the important ones, and that's, as we say, what matters. His great-nephew, Austin Washington, is with us, the author of The Education of George Washington. It's published by Regnery History and subtitled, How a Forgotten Book Shaped the Character of a Hero. What, pray tell, is this book? And if I'm not mistaken, that book is completely contained within your book.
It is indeed. Right? It is indeed, and it is. I could read you the full title. I've referred to it for years. I've referred to it as I've been working on it as the panegyric or the panegyric to Schönberg. The full title, I don't think you want me to read it, but it's A Panegyric to the Memory of His Grace Frederick, late Duke of Schönberg. Ready? Marquis of Harwich, Earl of Brentford, Count of the Holy Empire, Stateholder of, it goes on, Grandee of Spain and General of all His Majesty's land forces, and Knight of the Most Noble Order of the Garter.
Grand, omnipotent, imperial stomper.
And yet, the point is, so he got this. This is actually really amazing. No, this is actually amazing. I'm stopping you in your tracks, Jim, to make this point. Because, here I've been kidding around about these popular myths about George Washington, but this is actually incredibly cool. Because what I was saying in a humorous way before is true on a serious level, too.
All right.
Which is, people don't like George. They've just built George Washington, the library out there at Mount Vernon, as you may know. They've not completely cataloged his papers to this day, and so this thing that he wrote when he was 15 was shown to me that no one has ever talked about before in 200 years, as far as I know.
Now, first of all, that title you gave refers to whom? Obviously, somebody who had a very large business card with very small print, but exactly who was that person?
So he was a guy, a professional soldier in Europe with all of those titles and with all of that possibility of being a real son of a bitch, as those guys could be. Lord Fairfax apparently was. Do you know about Lord Fairfax? He would.
Fairfax County is named for him.
No, but he was not. He was a guy who had ultimate power. Especially in America, and he acted like it. He would take. He was just the worst thing a lord could possibly be. But this count guy was what you imagine in a fairy story a prince would be. He really was that way. He had all this power, but he was humble. You were talking about Mount Vernon a moment ago. Sorry, that was off the air, but you were. And, Mount Vernon, if you think about it, it's a stately place, but it's restrained. It's not ostentatious. Right?
Not terribly, no.
And so George Washington, so this count, this duke, he ended up a duke, died, and his minister wrote a book about him, talking about his qualities and his characters and his characteristics and his things of that nature. And George Washington bought this when he was 15, and no one has ever known this before. No one has ever talked about this before, and it's important because it's the only book he bought at that point in his life, and he didn't buy another book for years. A lot of people believe this thing called the Rules of Civility is somehow important. Mm-hmm. It was this sort of list of rules that he wrote as a writing exercise when he was 13.
Yes.
The fact that it still exists shows that it's not important, because if it were important, he would have folded it up and stuck it in his pocket and read it over and over again. He didn't do that. But with this book, he bought it, and he was apparently, I believe, obsessed by it. It certainly shaped his character. He bought it just when his father had died 4 years earlier. He'd stopped going to school around that time, and he went out into the wilderness and did all the things that made him great and famous. And somehow, at the same time, he developed this amazing character. And it seems to me that this is the key.
that this book that he took to his own heart and took it as that which should be the basis for his life. To what extent do we know about how his parents may have shaped this character?
Well, his father died when he was 11.
Yeah.
His mother was allegedly, in a lot of these books, they want to turn everything into a soap opera. His mother was clearly in a very troubled position when her husband died, and she maybe was very worried about things, and maybe she wasn't the most open, loving, warm-hearted person. But the thing is, you can tell that George Washington wasn't that close to his mother because there are letters, I can tell you about one later, where he wrote one thing to his brother and another thing to his mother about the same incident. He spoke to his mother in a much more formal way. So he probably wasn't close to his mother. I think he was close to his father. I think it's clear he was.
But of course, at the age of 11, that ended.
Right. But that's why I think, the cherry tree story, he did say 50 years later, one of the most important things was honesty, and he did get these kind of things from. And the other thing about life back then, of course, is as a kid you didn't go off to school at such a young age. You were tutored around the house or whatever, and so he was around his father all the time for those 11 years.
Now he wasn't well-to-do, if I am not mistaken, until he married Martha, right? That's where the money came from and the connections.
Yeah, there were basically two classes in Virginia at that time, and he was the bottom part of the top class. Okay. I didn't realize he was that high. Okay. Well,
they were pretenders to being landed gentry, but not quite.
Well, do you know the story of even how the Washingtons came to America?
I don't.
Oh, you don't? Oh, it's so cool. It's amazing. So it was an accident. It was during...
They made a sharp left turn at Bordeaux.
It's like he turned left at Greenland. Exactly. It was... Oh, no, that's right. It was John Lennon. So it was during Cromwell, and they weren't getting along well. And so my great sort of grandfather was on...
when the British monarchy was in serious jeopardy.
Right. And we were monarchists at that time, by the way. Sadly enough. But so he was on a boat trading, trading with the colonies, and his boat ran aground, and it took a long time to they already had the tobacco on board, and it was all wet, and they're there for months, and during those months, he fell in love with an American who had lots of land, and whose father was a judge. And about that time, there was a conflict with who got the money that he felt he was owed from being as part of this trading expedition, even though he stopped halfway through. And it was taken to a court in Virginia, which was run by the father of his bride-to-be.
Oh!
And we're not sure what happened in that court case, but he ended up relatively rich. But the way things worked back then, people had lots of children, and the land got divided up, and by the time George came along, it was a couple of generations later, and he didn't have a lot. He had a little, but he didn't have a lot. And so he went out at the age of 17, 18 to make it in the world. Yeah. And that's the thing that I think lots of people don't understand about George Washington. He is the original Horatio Alger guy. People think of him, and my book is supposed to show how he became the way he was. Yeah. Because people think of him, he's kind of boring, he didn't smile a lot, he had bad teeth, he was a great president. But, he was an amazing person his whole life, but especially when he was young, when he was out making it.
A surveyor, among other things.
He was a surveyor, and he was... Exactly. And his older half-brothers had gone to this boarding school in England, and they'd had servants, and they'd been fed with silverware, and they'd sat at nice tables, and they had good manners, and they never would have made it in America the way George did. So he went out on this surveying expedition, and, he was, sleeping on the ground and being eaten by insects and making friends with Indians and traders
almost
and woodsmen.
Freezing to death in a river at one point.
Yeah, and all of that. And but the thing is... But what separated him from the woodsmen and stuff like that wasn't... he had enough of a kind of education, and he kind of had this... Yeah. He was kind of like a gentleman.
Well, I want to come back and pursue some more of that when we continue our discussion. Austin Washington, the book, The Education of George Washington. Welcome back to the Jim Bohannon Show. We're learning about that guy, George Washington. And we're learning about it from his great-nephew, Austin Washington, the author of The Education of George Washington, how a forgotten book shaped the character of a hero. It's published by Regnery History. And Saturday, if you did not know, would have been Washington's 282nd birthday, although I'm sure he wouldn't look a day over 225 if he were actually around today. Now, we're talking about Washington, the young man, who his father died when he was 11, and this was a family with, I guess, some pretense, if you will, of being part of the landed gentry. They were on the fringes, if you will. Not poor, but then again, not really, really rich either. George sets out to make his mark, and as Austin puts it, the original Horatio Alger, that he goes forth, and he does a lot of dangerous things in his youth. I know at one point he was chased onto an island where he had been in freezing weather in the water, and might very well have perished, but it got so cold overnight that the river froze and they were able to walk off the island. He at one point was almost killed in the French and Indian Wars. This is a guy who did not exactly have a pampered youth, did he?
That's correct. Out of his own choice, he wanted to do these things. Of course, my book isn't just about these adventurous things that happened to him. It's about what it took inside, the forces inside him that he got from this book that enabled him to do things that, even my great-grandfathers, his brothers, I have two great set of grandfathers who were brothers, neither of them did what he did. So it wasn't just his family, it wasn't just in his environment. Something made him special. And in my belief is, he was the older brother, and that was probably part of it, but his father died, he stopped school, and he got this book. And I really believe, and so when you read the book, you don't just get these adventures, you also get how he did it and why he did it.
Now tell me more about this Duke, since apparently this book about this Duke was a seminal factor in shaping the man's character. What all is this Duke alleged to have done or been? In other words, what characteristics existed in that person that George tried to emulate?
But what I tried to avoid doing in this book is having like a list of 7 attributes or 11 characteristics, because that's not helpful or useful. I do have it set up so each chapter is kind of focused on one.
Okay.
And so I say, you could say,
let's
for example,
pick a chapter or two.
For example, one is temperance. But if I say temperance, I spend sort of 8 or 9 or 10 pages explaining what that meant, because it doesn't mean what you think of temperance as meaning. It meant... Well, it's complicated.
Please feel free.
This is radio.
That's the beauty, and it's a long-form interview. So
okay.
I'll tell you my favorite. I'll tell you my favorite the temperance characteristic, but you need to explain what we mean by temperance.
I'd rather tell you an easier one, and my favorite one, and one that you just mentioned.
We'll come back to temperance.
So you talked about him being shot, and you talked about being thrown into the river.
Right.
And we talked about his mother and writing differently to his brother than to his mother. All of those come together in this one thing that was one of the most important things in his life, which is what he referred to continually throughout his life as Providence. And so when he was in this battle, and again, later on, the number of horses that were shot out from under him seemed to have grown. When he told the story, it kind of grew throughout his life. But nonetheless,
well, that happened.
He had a couple of horses shot out from under him, and bullets through his cape, one through his hat, or 2 through... I forget the numbers now. But he had all... And so when he wrote to his mother, he said, boy, in essence, was I lucky. And he basically did the 18th century version of copying and pasting. He had written the exact same things to his commanding officer. But when he wrote to his brother, he said, Providence saved me. And the amazing thing is there was a battle in which an Indian marksman had been specifically assigned to shoot at George Washington. And he took, the accounts vary, 17 or 19 shots at George Washington. And he gave up for the exact same reason that George Washington thought that he wasn't shot. Because the Indian said, what's wrong? I'm not hitting this guy. He must be protected by the Great Spirit, as he put it. And so, one of the fundamental things that one of the most fundamental things that George Washington believed was Providence was protecting him and guiding him. And the thing is, if you're a cynic and you don't believe it, it's still the case that George Washington wouldn't have put himself in those precarious situations if he didn't believe in it.
Whether he was actually protected or not is not as important to the story as the fact that he believed it and therefore would behave in ways that others of us might not go down that path.
Well, that's arguable. I think that if he had believed in it and it wasn't true, maybe he would have been shot. I don't know.
So you're saying that there may have been a certain amount of prudence with this fatalism. Now I must know more about temperance that isn't temperance as we think it is.
I think I was thinking about that earlier today because it was the hardest and most difficult thing I tried to explain, and now you're asking me to explain it.
Well, it can't be that hard. You wrote the book.
I did write the book.
Paraphrase yourself.
Temperance. Well, I finally, at the end of my little essay, which precedes the stories of George Washington's life in which this is reflected, I just talk about how it, in essence, meant keeping his cool. I mean, it meant lots of things in lots of different situations. But, for example, he had a rotten temper all of his life, a ferocious temper. And yet, there are stories of people trying to at least make him smile when he was president. They couldn't even do that because he had succeeded in having at least a facade that he found helpful and useful in life. So he was able to control himself.
To what extent was the unwillingness to smile his embarrassment about his teeth? Again, another thing that we've been told, so let's put it to the test.
Well, I mean, that's surely some of it. But I know that there was, I think the wife of a British diplomat said, I mean, again, I'm putting this into our language.
I understand.
But she basically said,
that.
"Oh man, that guy has such a temper," and so at one point she said something to him like, "I'm not one of these guys who can reel off quotes off the top of my head. I'm sorry, but basically she said, 'Oh, I think I can detect something by your countenance,' and George Washington proudly said, 'You have never detected anything by my countenance.'" And so so the fact that he didn't smile wasn't just his teeth. He realized he was in such an amazing, at the end of his life, again, my book takes you through all of his life, but at the end of his life when he was president, he was in such an awesome position, and he just really thought, just the way he acted would affect how the country went in some
and he wasn't entirely wrong in that regard.
Exactly.
Now, one thing about his temper, coupled with the fact that he was something of a giant by the stature of the men of his time. He was 6'3" and weighed about 200 pounds, I have read, and which is to say, today, a good-sized man. Back then, humongous. And there's one story at one time, I think, of soldiers squabbling and Washington riding up on the soldiers and just pretty much ripping them apart. A temper in a guy that big could be a pretty serious thing.
Yeah. I mean, there was one man in the army apparently taller than he was. But I think the average height back then was about 5 inches or 4.5 inches shorter than it is today.
Yeah. And today the average person ain't 6'3".
There's not a lot of stories about him losing his temper, just that he had a bad temper. Yeah. So I can't, I mean, I know, when he was a commander during the early part of his life, out when he was on the British side, he had soldiers executed. I mean, that's maybe not something you do out of temper, but I mean, you have to be a very strong and, I mean, he wasn't one of these guys you see in Starbucks around, Washington, D.C., where I just was before I came here.
He was not a metrosexual.
Yeah, exactly. He wasn't a metrosexual. And, but I mean, there's a fine, the thing is, when you have a temper, it's just a sign of a kind of energy that he learned to focus in a more productive way than most people who have tempers.
Stay with us, more to come. We're going to learn more about this man from the book, The Education of George Washington. Great nephew, Austin Washington, our guest. Back in a moment. Never did understand quite what sticking a feather in your cap and calling it macaroni was about, although I think it had to do with the fashion of the time, if I'm not mistaken. But then again, it gets lost in translation. Suffice it to say, a little theme music from the era, as it were. If we had a nice string quartet, well, we would probably shower that on you as well. We're talking about The Education of George Washington, how a forgotten book shaped the character of a hero, published by Regnery History and written by our guest, Washington's great nephew, Austin Washington. The book itself, was it commonly available? Was it printed in large quantities, or was it a pure fluke that young George at age 15 came across this book?
Well, he got it from his cousin Bailey. You know, when I learned about it, I Googled it, and I got 0 hits. And so then I tried Googling things like flying monkeys with ice cream, and I would get, 10,000.
Sure you would.
I looked in the Library of Congress. I looked in the depository libraries in England, and I couldn't find it. And since then, you can see it out. It's a little bit out there now, but it was really not known for 200 years. At the time, I don't know. I don't know how many of these were printed, but it obviously wasn't a very common thing. George Washington's copy still exists, I believe, in a library in Boston, where a lot of his books ended up.
Interesting, but suffice it to say, there it is, and this person brings forward in the book about this Duke characteristics that the young George Washington tried to emulate. What other characteristics? We talked about a few of them here, but other things that were in that book that, judging by the record of how Washington behaved, that apparently the book shaped the man he became.
Right. Well, I just want to stress again that it's not just about a list of attributes.
I understand.
It's about the things that you can get from the book that you can't get from this interview. But I'm flipping through the book now. I've not been asked to temperance. The Providence. We have duty was his greatest passion.
Okay.
We have his affable, candid, and obliging. See, there's a good one.
Affable?
Let's take this one.
Whoever described George Washington as affable?
But see, that's the thing. It's so important because he went off on his little woods expedition at with his the Fairfax nephew or whatever he was.
Right.
And
the moneyed connection.
Right. And so here we have the Lord Fairfax just being a complete twat to everyone. I mean, even to George Washington's older half-brother. He gave him a petition. Lord Fairfax shoved it in his pocket, never took it out. He could do anything he wanted to do. He dressed in a strange way. So anyway, here George Washington was out in the frontier, and had he gone to the private school in England that his half-brothers had gone to, he would have inevitably become kind of a snob. Instead, he was out there suddenly dealing with Indians, dealing with woodsmen, dealing with all sorts of people, and his ability throughout his life to deal with people from all sorts of parts of society, is not what most people of that, because it was a really super class-conscious society. I've heard some amazing things. You don't probably understand how class-conscious it was. In like the 1600s and maybe early 1700s in New England, I remember reading the working, whatever you call them, the non-aristocratic people would literally, they'd kind of almost be in terror of upper-class people the way we would be, or some of us would be, if we saw a Hollywood celebrity. They were seen as being something from a different universe. And the fact that George Washington was able to get along with these people, to get along with all sorts of people, Indians and woodsmen, it gave him, you couldn't possibly have been the leader of the country or the leader of the army if he hadn't had those experiences.
On the other hand, again, the term affable, I think, for example, of the back-slapping qualities, hearty fellow and all this sort of thing, the Falstaffian character that is not George Washington. I mean, I've heard it said, and I truly believe it, that George Washington today, possessed of all of his physical and mental and moral characteristics in this media-happy universe, could never, ever, 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 ever be elected president of the United States. Your thoughts?
Wow. Well, Jimbo, so I was going to answer the first...
Do you agree or disagree with that?
George Washington... Well, if George
was
Washington
he affable enough to kiss babies?
You ask a tough question, Jim. The thing is, we're shaped by our environments. And had George Washington...
All right.
Let's take it this way. Had George Washington... I own some of George Washington's hair. And I
own some of his hair?
And
really?
I could clone him. And we could run an experiment.
Frighteningly enough, we probably are only a few years away from doing precisely what Austin just said.
But my theory is that George Washington changed a lot because he got this book, right? So if George Washington had been born, 50 years ago, and had this book,
yeah,
how would he have ended up? Well, he would have ended up a lot different than he ended up. Could he have ever developed this smarminess, this honesty, the double-sided, the shallowness that almost
if
every
you can fake
politician
sincerity,
alive?
you've got it made.
No. I don't think he ever could.
Not that, but he would have, just by virtue of being focused and ambitious, he would have probably learned to be, for example, media savvy. But he would have gone off message and blurted out the truth instead of answering it the way his advisors told him to on Face the Nation.
No, but here you have to see. Here's the thing, Jimbo. There was this one incident when he was trying to make an impression to the country where he actually did ride in his carriage, along the way. And as soon as he got to a town, he'd get out of his carriage, he'd get on his horse, and ride on his white charger through the town. He was media savvy.
I did not know about that story. That's very interesting.
So it wasn't...
All right, then I take it back. He might have done very well.
The difference... and the thing was, think about his biography/autobiography. He was not a complete idiot. And he was not a naive person. And so he, as I said earlier in the show, if you guys missed it out there, he he co-wrote what was an unfinished, but someone has stitched it together recently, a biography/autobiography. And he was perfectly happy to say no one has ever, I forget the exact quote, but no one has ever been known to throw a rock quite as, far as George Washington did. And he was writing about himself in the third person.
That's always a bad sign.
He knew that if people thought that way about him, it would help consolidate people. It's hard.
Well, we're going to have to come back in just a second here because we have bills to pay, and we will continue our look at George Washington, the education thereof, in just a moment. Good to have you with us on the Jim Bohannon Show as we're talking about the man tonight who was first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen, George Washington. And in a mere 5 minutes here in the Eastern Time Zone, it will be his 282nd birthday. Austin Washington, great-nephew and author of the book The Education of George Washington, is our guest. Joe calls in from Gainesville, Georgia. Hello, Joe. What do you know?
Hi, Joe.
Well, hey, Mr. Washington. Hey, Mr. Bohannon, thank you so much for taking my call. This is so exciting. Great interview, Jim, as always.
Thank you.
So educated here, and I can't wait to get the book. Mr. Washington, I just had a question. I haven't heard you cover this yet about President Washington's layout of Washington, D.C. and his involvement with the Masonic order and the French architect, and I can't remember his name.
Pierre Lafon, the guy who laid out the city.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Y'all can discuss that. I'll hang up and take my air.
All right, very good. I'm not sure the extent to which that's covered here, but suffice it to say that Washington did have some views about the subject, and of course, Crazy Pierre laid out a city designed to protect it from ground attack, which was tried on exactly one occasion in 1814, and the British ran through us rather quickly. So it didn't work out too well, but we do have traffic problems resulting from Pierre to this very day. So go ahead, Austin.
I realized the other day that I had the Masonic thing is not mentioned in the book. I went to the anniversary of his funeral at Mount Vernon in 1999, and they had Masons there doing what they had done in his original funeral, and he certainly was a part of that organization. My intuition is that the sort of people who were Masons then are kind of different from the sort of people who are Masons today. I didn't go into that in the book. He certainly was a member. A lot of people were members of it. He was also a member of the vestry of his church. And yet, famously when he was president, he would go to church on the day they had communion, but he wouldn't take communion. And when somebody suggested that he should take communion, it would be a good example for everyone else. Rather than taking communion, he stopped going to church on those days. So he definitely deeply believed in Providence, and I know that is similar to the Masonic views on it. And he was a member, but I didn't really go into that in the book. My only thought is that it was kind of a thing that people did the way they are vestrymen of their church, and I'm not sure how deeply into it he was, and I'm not sure if people tend to have great conspiracy theories about things that are really banal, And I said, I don't want to insult these guys, but I have to say, the reason I didn't want to touch it in the book is when I saw these guys, I thought, oh, they were just kind of like, they just weren't inspiring-looking people. I don't think they're ruling the world secretly. I just don't.
Well, that's obvious nonsense. I mean, you go with a list of people. I mean, Gene Autry was a Mason. There's a host of Babe Ruth. I mean, just a host of people. Suffice it to say, it's an interesting look at a man about whom we should know a great deal more. It's called The Education of George Washington, published by Regnery History and written by his great-nephew, our guest, Austin Washington. Stay with us, more to come on The Bohannon Show. I'm Jim Bohannon, and this is Westwood One.
AustinWashington.com